evening, and welcome to the Merchant's House Museum. Tonight's subject for our garden chats for 2014 is, as I've called it, a house in the country, Seabright, the Tredwell Farm at 16 Ridge Road, Rumson, New Jersey. It's a beautiful July night here in New York City, but as we all know or have heard, July can be brutal in the city. And while we're sitting here in the garden enjoying a sip of wine and some beautiful breezes, is this something the Tredwell family, the occupants of this house, would have been doing on July 10th, 1854, 150 years ago? No, likelihood is that they would not have been, for a variety of reasons. There was a tradition in the city in those days to get out of it, particularly in the summer months, just the way there is today. And some of the reasons are the same, and some of them are very different. In this country, the tradition is not as old, naturally. The country's not as old. But even into the middle of the 18th century, most of the urban centers were little pockets of security in what was still rather a large wilderness. And so it simply wasn't safe to go too far beyond the settled territories. There were wild animals. There were still marauding Native Americans who were not very pleased with the fact that their lands had been taken from them. During the Revolution, of course, British and Hessian troops were known to plunder houses, and there was a lot of terrorism activity during the war, which we don't hear too much about nowadays. There were also brigands, cutthroats, and thieves just off the beaten paths and around, every large oak tree. So country seats were both expensive to maintain, but also expensive to keep secure. So most people did not have weekend getaways. Plus the fact that, let's face it, traveling out into the countryside was difficult. And so people sort of chose to stay in the urban centers because you were safe and it was easy to get around. But as the 19th century ensued, and families like the Tredwells began making a great deal of money in trade, being a merchant class, and the cities began expanding in terms of their size and their reach, and there was development all along the eastern seaboard of the United States. There came a growing trend for people who began purchasing country seats. Now, the country in those days would have been a lot closer than it is today. We're talking Pelham Bay area in the Bronx, we're talking Sheepshead Bay and Bay Ridge out in Brooklyn, the Bloomingdale area of the Upper West Side, which is the area just south of Columbia University, which was an established Dutch village and a getaway for people all through the 19th century. A hotel opened in Coney Island in 1829, and that was mostly a working class destination. So by the 1820s, people were getting away for the day, if not for the month or the season. There was also Elysian Fields in Weehawken and Hoboken, which was a preferred destination for day trippers. You would take a boat, a ferry across the Hudson to the Elysian Fields, have a picnic, enjoy the entertainment and the sights, and then return back to your home in the evening. So by the 1820s, this was quite common. The first of the big destination resorts was the Catskill Mountain House, which was built in 1824, way upriver, just 12 miles away from the town of Catskill. And in fact, roads were so bad in the 1820s that it took as long to take the boat from the piers down here in Lower Manhattan all the way to Catskill as it took to get the next 12 miles on land from Catskill to the mountain house itself. So when you went to the mountain house, you didn't go even for an overnight trip. You went for the month. You went for the whole season. And you also had money because the Catskill Mountain House was expensive and it was the destination for the well-to-do. In the teens, in the 20s, and the 30s, there were continuing outbreaks of yellow fever and cholera in the city. We didn't have a water system in those days. There was no reservoir system. So people were drawing water from the ground, from wells, or from springs further up island. There was not a reliable sanitation system in terms of sewers. And so there were continued outbreaks of disease. all through the early 19th century. And merchant class New Yorkers began buying their own country getaways, both to escape these outbreaks of pestilence, as well as just to get away from the stinks and the crowds and the noise of the city during the summer months. There were several outbreaks of both cholera and yellow fever in 1832, which was the year Seabury Tredwell, the patriarch of this family, bought the first of the property that later became their farm in New Jersey. And so it's likely, hi, good evening. Please have a seat. It's likely that that was not a coincidence. It could have been a motivating factor in the Tredwells saying, it's time to buy something where we can get away for the summer months. Now, in September of 1832, Seabury bought 700 acres of land in the Black Point area of Rumson, New Jersey. You all know where Rumson is? It's in Monmouth County. It's not terribly far from here by boat. A pigeon or a seagull would find it easy to fly. By land, it's quite circuitous because you have to go around Raritan Bay. So it's both very close and very far. A year later, in the spring of 1833, he bought an additional 150 acres and combined them into what essentially was quite a huge property. This property included an 18th century main house, a tenant farmer's house, barns and stables, an oyster pond, other outbuildings, and even a small wooden bridge over a little creek that divided the main property from the main road, which later came to be called Ridge Road. They named the property Seabright, which later became the name of a beach resort on the Barrier Beach Island, just a few miles away from the house. And is there a connection? We don't know, but there probably is. In 1835, Seabury Tredwell bought what's now the Merchants House Museum, this building right here, which was built in 1832, the year they bought their first investment of property in Seabright. And at that point, he hunkered down for the next 30 years. He had his townhouse, a very elegant house in the city, in the newest part of town. He had what became a very comfortable working farm and getaway in Rumson, New Jersey. And so he was pretty much made and could retire in style for the next remaining 30 years of his life. Now, both he and Mrs. Tredwell had family connections in Rumson, New Jersey, which held back to the 17th century, so it was a logical place for them, I should say, to decide to buy a country property since they had connections there already. The oldest part of the house itself, the house in Rumson, dates back to 1710, 1711, and it was apparently constructed on the site of an even earlier house dating back to the 1670s. It eventually became the dining room wing of a sizable Georgian residence that, as far as we know, was completed by 1753. The main house was covered in what we call fish scale shingles, and this is actually a style that you see quite commonly in the few remaining 18th century structures in Monmouth County. So it was some sort of a local style. The main house had a center hall and front and back parlors, actually very similar in floor plan to this house, only the center hall was quite huge. It was plenty big to be a room in and of itself. And in the hot summer months, it was quite common for people to open the front and back doors in the center hall and let the breeze flow through, so you had a nice flow of air during the hottest time of the day. Later on, the rear parlor in the house was converted into a library. We don't know if it was by the Tredwells or by a later occupant. And there was a maze of bedrooms that filled the second stories in both wings of the house. The house and property of Seabright remained legendary in local lore. There was a lot of history associated with the house both before the Tredwells occupancy and after. One owner of the house prior to the Tredwells occupancy was a blood ancestor of Abraham Lincoln. Interestingly enough, we don't know whether the Tredwells knew that or not, but that's interesting. Another who lived there in the 1750s, the gentleman who completed the Georgian structure, worked very closely with King George II in espionage work during the French and Indian War. And in fact, in the 1930s, when some alterations were made to the house, a letter was found hidden behind one of the mantelpieces in the house from King George II to that occupant. and that letter is now in the Monmouth County Historical Society. Other owners included a mill owner and a Monmouth County judge. So these were prominent people occupying this house and estate right from the inception. All through the mid-19th century, the Tredwells visited the house regularly themselves, and apparently they did not just treat it as a summer house, though it would have been a logical place for them to spend the entire summer. We have a letter in existence from Phoebe, one of the Tredwell daughters, to her sisters, dated November 1st, and she wrote it from here to her sisters who are in the house at Seabright. So November can still be a very beautiful month, particularly the first half of it, and so we know the Tredwells were using the house at least into the late fall. They enjoyed a quiet, idyllic existence there, and they kept a low profile in the community of Rumson, just the way they did here. Their names crop up here in New York diaries as well as in Rumson, but only just in passing. They did not take a major leading position in society in either New York or Rumson. They preferred to live a quiet existence and sort of keep a low profile. They also made very few changes to the house. Here in the city, they tended to keep up with fashion and made alterations in the house so that the house suited the way city houses were being used. They installed a dumbwaiter, they installed heating in the fireplaces, coal burners, they kept the kitchen updated, that sort of thing. But as far as we know down in Rumson, they kept the house pretty much the way they found it. So they were obviously very happy with it just the way it was. Now, how did they get there? It seems, Rumson is a hop, skip, and a jump nowadays. There's bus connections, there's train connections. It's easy to get there. But in 1835, really the only reliable way, the only comfortable way of getting there was by boat. And so we assume that the Tredwells traveled there by several steamship lines. And there were two major steamship ports within easy connection with Rumson. One of them was Keyport, which is a major port even to this day on the Raritan Bay side of Monmouth County. It was 13 miles away from Rumson, so it was a bit of a trek in those days with rough roads. And it's more likely that the Tredwells, particularly earlier in the century, may have opted for one of the steamship lines traveling to Eatontown Dock, which is now known as Oceanport, which is less than 6 miles from their house. And so even if the roads were rough, it would have been an easier trip than 13 miles from Keyport. And later on in the century, when the trains, there were several train connections throughout Monmouth County, and some of them were incorporated into a commuter rail now. So it's likely that they could have taken the train as well. We don't know for a fact that they did. What did they do out in Rumson? Well, we know that the boys were very fond of hunting, and so they must have done a lot of that while they were out there. Bathing was always one of the activities of choice. There was boating, long strolls, and Gertrude, the youngest daughter, was very fond of collecting seashells and making moss seaweed art. And we have quite a large number of examples of Gertrude's artistic sensibility, for lack of a better word, in taking moss and seaweed and making something artistic out of it. There was horse racing. The Tredwells were avid horse racers. And we know that they raced horses up in what's now Harlem around St. Nicholas Avenue. And they probably did a lot of general hanging out. One of the interesting things they also did, we know for a fact, is that they loved to play croquet. We have their croquet set here in the museum collection, and it is quite banged up. Now, we sincerely doubt they played croquet back here. So the logical alternate choice is that they played croquet, and apparently hours and hours and hours of it in Seabright. And they loved the game enough so that eventually, when they disposed of the house, the croquet set wound up here. I would like to read a couple of pages to you from a book called A House in Time, written by Susan L. Pulsifer in the 1950s. She was raised in a house on West 11th Street, just up the street from here. And her generation is the generation after Gertrude. She was born, actually, 2 generations after Gertrude. She was born in the 1890s, but she was born into a family of rarefied social level. Her father was very affluent. They, in fact, bought 2 houses and put them together, so they owned a double-row house right up here. They were members of the Washington Square Association. They traveled in the same social circles as the Tredwells, and up until the advent of electricity and the change in social behavior after World War I, they basically lived the same lifestyle, the Tredwells. And so her memoirs of traveling to their beach every summer, which would have been Far Rockaway, not Rumson, I think are very applicable. And so I'd like to read you her recollections of her childhood spent on the shore. Spring and fall, as regularly as the seasons, there was the move from West 11th Street to the high ocean beach of Far Rockaway, Long Island. Much of our utilitarian as well as ornamental surroundings of every day moved with us, going in the great yellow moving van of Mr. Burtis of Bayswater. But not only the household belongings traveled with us to Long Island, all the more subtle and intimate parts of our lives moved there also, and lived on, heightened and enhanced in the fresh air and bright sun and the high, free winds and waves. Our accustomed stiff black boots were discarded, and our bare feet were allowed to enjoy the dewy grass and the endless wading pools. Penny, who was their cook, Penny blossomed in fresh striped gingham of pink and blue, leaving behind her rusty black even on church days. And our rabbits ventured forth too fearlessly, running utterly wild after their confined backyard existences, and, failing to return home on bright moonlit nights, were exposed to the bloody ravages of the neighborhood dogs. The birds escaped their cages, happy to join the company of unfettered song sparrows of hedge and meadow, and Gilly, their puppy, moved to Long Island only to find, blissfully, his arch enemy, the Buffum's pug, living even nearer in the neighboring lane. Our everyday life and inclinations seemed to be intensified and granted freedom of expression at Far Rockaway. In moving to the shore, I seemed unconsciously and yet certainly to feel that we moved closer to some mysterious, yet still stable and real source of life and living. Here the accompanying nurse could be successfully tricked out of our way and avoided more easily than in the city. Here our feet escaped their shoes as we ran barefoot on the lawns. Not only were our pets and their adversaries, our household and its furnishings removed to the freedom of the beach, Uncle Tom came too, a most welcome and regular visitor, as in New York, only here he brought a picnic with him. Uncle Tom's picnic consisted of large potatoes to roast for sunset supper on the beach, and never has any meal equaled in interest and savor this one, with a dining table of wide sand dunes and an oven dug in the sand where we buried the potatoes, lighting a huge bonfire on top. The outdoor roasting lent an indescribably delicious tang to the fare. Here at Far Rockaway, my sister and I could ride bicycles up and down the dirt paths that laced the wide lawns. Bicycle riding in the city, and even on Fifth Avenue, was allowed our brothers in New York, but it was, as a matter of course, not considered proper for budding young ladies. My mother and older sister complied, of course, with the strict etiquette of the fashionable Long Island bathing beach, wearing long black stockings with their high-necked and often long-sleeved bathing dress. One of the lady bathers at our club beach even wore long gloves into the sea to protect her arms from freckles. I used to marvel at this lady, who proved to be a better swimmer than any of the others, adventuring with her daring dives and steady, long-gloved stroke way outside the lifelines and the supervision of our tanned and trusty lifeguard, Matt. I early rode on Matt's broad shoulders fearlessly out through the tallest breakers, and I remember his patiently endeavoring to teach my small brother the rudiments of swimming in the clear and shallow pools just off the beach. But William could not be kept on the surface. He always wanted to swim down to touch or catch the intriguing little fish swimming below. It's a wonderful picture. We think of people living in those days as being so stuffy and so constricted. And here, I mean, it's so wonderful to think of our Gertrude as we all think of her kicking off her shoes and running around barefoot on the lawns of Seabright and gathering her seashells and bicycling on the paths. People were not that different than we are today, is the moral of the story. So, we're moving away from the idyllic afternoon spent at the farm and entering the later 19th century. In 1865, after Seabury's death, again, the father of the family, his son-in-law and executor, Effingham Nichols, developed and divided the property. The intention was to sell large lots suitable for country homes, or villas as they called them, for the affluent. Most of the developed properties were also used as getaways by the families who bought the land. In 1870, the opening of the Seabright-Rumson Bridge made the area even more attractive for development. The Tredwell sisters gradually sold off parcels of land, sustaining them for the remainder of their lives. Remember, these were genteel ladies who were not raised, certainly, to work and earn a living. So, gradually selling off parcels of the farm permitted them to continue their genteel style of life through the remainder of their lives. After Mrs. Tredwell's death, in 1882, the following were sold at auction: 1 pair of coach horses, 1 pair of black mares, 3 farm horses, 1 bull, 13 cows, implying that the farm was still being actively worked as late as 1882, but now was about to go fallow. Gertrude, the youngest and ultimately last surviving child of the family, was very fond of visiting Saratoga Springs later in her life. She used to go there with a nephew of hers. So it's unknown how often she visited Seabright later in her life, if at all. The property obviously gradually shrunk in size until she finally sold off the last remaining piece, consisting of 6 acres in the main house, in 1928, when she was 88 years old. A year later, after the crash, the property would have been worth a fraction of what she had received for it just a year before. So her timing was good in that respect. Subsequent owners made several additions to the house in the 1930s and 1950s, but they kept the 6 acres, the remaining final 6 acres of the property intact. It eventually became one of the largest parcels of property remaining in Rumson, which is a very affluent community. So these large parcels, you start, eyeing them, and you start salivating. The house was always considered charming and stylish, and it was also understood to be an important part of local Rumson history. In 1999, Arthur and Leslie Parent became the last owners of the property and filed a request to subdivide the land and demolish the buildings on December 18, 2000. This created a huge reaction, and an organization called the Tredwell Preservation Coalition tied up development in Monmouth County courts for several years. Members of our Merchant House Museum volunteers attended demonstrations and hearings. And before I tell you what the ultimate fate of the house was, I'd like to first of all show you an image of the house in its glory days. This photo was taken long after the Tredwells were there, but they certainly would have recognized what they were looking at. And here is an actual photo of the Tredwells seated on the back porch of Seabright, taken sometime before 1882, because the elderly woman in the photo is definitely Mrs. Tredwell, Mrs. Eliza Tredwell, who passed in 1882. So it must be very, very early 1880s. And if you notice, the fish scale shingles are very clearly visible in this photo. Before I tell you of the ultimate fate of Seabright, I'd just like to tie it in with the situation we find ourselves confronted with now. Seabright, as I mentioned, was always considered an important historical document and a landmark in Rumson, New Jersey. Landmarks, unfortunately, are only intact as long as they're permitted to remain so. And you may or may not know that the Merchant's House, which is a national, state, and city landmark and on the Register of National Historic Places, is under serious threat right now. A few months ago, the Landmarks Preservation Commission of the city approved construction of an 8-story hotel building to be built in this little skinny lot right next door to this house. Now, while we're sure the developers mean no harm to the merchant's house at all the backhoes and the jackhammers and the bulldozers and the vibrations and the blasting and the cranes and all the digging and building are going to create a serious, serious challenge for our house. The merchant's house is now built on bedrock, it's built on fill. So when they begin excavating next door, we run the serious risk of having our foundation undermined. There are other examples of houses in Greenwich Village of an equal age or even newer that have collapsed simply because the vibrations were too much for them. And this is the last surviving intact house of the 19th century in New York City. So I just want to draw your attention to the threat and let you know that we are inviting people to help, and help means basically opening your checkbooks and contributing to the legal fund, because we are hiring engineers and hiring lawyers and making sure that even something as simple as having our amazing plasterwork in the house not collapse, which you could very well do, be prevented, and the only way we can do that is by money. So please consider, supporting the legal fund. Keep in touch with us. Get on our email list, so we'll keep you apprised of what's happening. And we invite you all to become friends of the only remaining Tredwell house. And that brings me back to the sad end of this saga of Seabright. Thursday, June 15th, 2006, the boarded up and empty main house mysteriously was engulfed in a raging fire. No one knows how the fire started. The house was empty. There had been complaints filed against the owners that the property was becoming derelict and was being ignored, but for whatever reason, the house was engulfed in flames. The only apparent solution to extinguishing the fire in a nearly 300-year-old house was to bulldoze the property with a bulldozer that just happened to conveniently be right there. So, for understandable reasons, the fire was turned mysterious in origin. But be that as it may, we have some of the Tredwells' possessions from the house upstairs in our attic. We have a few photographs of the interior of the house. And if you go online and just research Tredwell House, Rumson, New Jersey, you'll see what kind of an outcry there was. But it's a little too late. So let's hope that doesn't happen to our beloved house here. And I want to thank you for your attention. Thank you. If you have any questions, I'm very happy to answer.
One of the questions that always comes up is, did the staff of 4 servants with them, or did they have an ongoing staff of people that were maintaining this property in the farmhouse?
I'm going to repeat this question. A question that's often asked, this is one of our volunteers, as a matter of fact. A question that's often asked as she leads people through the house is, did they, number one, bring their staff with them from here to Seabright for the summer months? And number two, was there a staff that was maintaining the Seabright residence? If I understand. Well, I would say yes to both questions. Seabright was a working farm, at least until 1882, and there was a tenant farmer's house on the property. So the Tredwells did not do their own farming, although it's very likely, certainly at Seabright, the produce of their land graced their table during the summer months, and it's also quite likely that a certain amount of produce came from Seabright throughout the course of the year and was eaten here in this house as well. Based on what we read in Ms. Pulsifer's book, and just knowing how hard it was to get good servants in the 19th century, I would venture to surmise that they brought their servants with them. And first of all, they needed their maids and assistants with them just as much there as they did here. You couldn't dress yourself any more easily in Seabright than you could here in New York. It was just probably a more laid-back style of dressing, though that photograph makes them look like they're ready to go to the ball. And I would think that the servants came with them from here, and maybe someone was retained to look after the house. The boys were working, so they probably did not take the entire summer off, so they may have been backing and forthing. A steamship trip to Oceanport is not very long. It's probably about an hour and a half, so it would have been like a commute today. So they probably left on a Thursday, took Fridays off, spent the weekends at Seabright, and then we're back Monday morning to be back at the office again. So very much what we do today. So I would say somebody was left here to maintain the house and keep guard over it, and maybe they came on a periodic basis. The regular servants staff here went to Seabright with them, and there was a year-round staff in Seabright maintaining the farm itself.
So he was paying them as well as...
Well, it was a working farm, so there was money coming in. There would have been money coming in from the farm produce and all that. And if it were a tenant farmer, the tenant farmer would have been paying him to farm the property. And in exchange, the house would have been free. It would have been part of his, would have been part of the deal. Other questions? Well, I've exhausted everyone. Thank you very much. The house is still open. The bar is still open. So now you can muse about how nice it would be to have your own tenant farm in Rumson, New Jersey, or probably today you would have to be somewhere up by Lake George or Plattsburgh for the same deal. But thank you very much for coming and enjoy the garden. And as I said, the house is still open. Good evening.